Okay, it is Friday. I might be having audio issues. Can anyone hear me?
You know what's crazy, Jacob? I hear you fine now.
Wait, really?
Yeah, you're
Oh
not
my.
dropping words.
We were just scrambling. We're 5 minutes late because we were scrambling trying to track down a phantom audio issue, and apparently now it's gone. This is
Well, it did come
hilarious.
back just a little bit, but it's a lot better than it was. So,
Well, we'll just have to see what happens. If I'm like cutting out or anything, then just let us know in the chat, and Daniel will have to do the show by himself, and I'll just be here doing magic tricks on the side or something.
oh, that'd be awesome.
Daniel, you're back from vacation. You're looking healthy. You're glowing. I am back from Vegas, barely hanging on. I'm having my tomato juice in the morning and trying to get the smell of casino smoke out of all my clothes. But we haven't had the show. We haven't had the band together in a little while. So let's see. We were talking about thoughts of the week. And of course, Vegas is going to Vegas, so I don't have your banner ready. So we were talking about your thought of the week being what triggers a new assessment.
Yeah. So what's been interesting is this conversation has come up a lot. I've talked to a couple of companies this week that have gotten their CMMC L2 certification, but now they're looking to move to the cloud. They're looking to extend from on-prem. We want to go into the cloud now, right? And so it got me percolating a little bit on a couple of things. Let's see here. I'm going to share my screen as I tend to do. So first we have the language from the CMMC L2 scoping guide on what triggers a new CMMC certification. And this concept of significant architectural boundary changes come up. So because that's very soft to say the best, and I know a lot of the questions that we had at CS2 a couple weeks ago from assessors asking Matt Travis, they were like, please define this just a little bit better. DoD define it better. Cyber AB, please define it better. So in lack of a better definition, I went hunting to figure out, one of the closer companions to CMMC, and that's FedRAMP, right? I was like, what does the FedRAMP program say about this? And the FedRAMP program references another NIST publication, NIST 837, and it talks about significant changes. And dear baby Jesus, it's a lot. It's actually a lot more than people assume it is. And maybe it's better that we don't have a better definition of this and leave it up to the organization to define significant changes. Because if they point to this NIST publication, you're going to have to get certified about every 3 weeks at this point.
I'm telling you guys, I've told you a million times, it is the number one pattern that you see over the years is stop asking the government for an answer if you don't want a government answer to your question. If you insist on asking them, what is a significant change? When do I need to have a new assessment based off of your idea of a significant change? You're going to get the answer out of the RMF. Back when SSPs were not a requirement, everybody said, how do I document? How do I document? How do I document? And then the government said, this is how we document. So that's how you're going to do it. And now the number one thing that people complain about is what? Too much documentation. So
Yep.
I know that it feels scary to not have defined things about this is how you do it. But that kind of flexibility is the kind of thing that you can take advantage of to do less work. So I highly doubt that anybody listening to this stream is, going to be the problem, but I guarantee you that we're going to keep pressing on this significance issue over time, and people are going to get a government answer and they're going to hate it.
Yeah, they're not good at providing good answers. Well, I'll say this. When they do provide an answer, it's too good of an answer, meaning it's usually hyper restrictive. But
Right.
yeah, if you look, we're looking at things like upgrading operating systems, modification to system ports, protocols, or services, installation of a new or upgraded hardware platform, modification to how PII is processed, modifications to cryptographic modules, changes in information types processed, stored, or transmitted by the system, modifications to security and privacy controls. Like, that's a lot, right?
Meanwhile, I think actually keep talking because I'll pull up the ODP memo because I believe that has a very nebulous definition of significant change in it.
Yeah, because then we have things like moving to a new facility, adding new core missions or business functions, acquiring specific and credible threat info that the organization is being targeted by a threat source, or establishing new modified laws, directives, policies, or, in our favorite world, regulations. Yeah. So when you look at the NIST publication, I'm just like, I don't want to look at that for significant change definition because it's too much.
Yep.
And so again, it's one of those things where don't ask for it, make some good internal logical decisions. And what I told an organization this week is, have documented what you deem a significant change, and have your vetting and change control process pull that up when changes are made to the environment. And if it maps to that requirement or that definition that you've defined internally for better clarity, then good. And if somebody challenges you on it saying, hey, in the absence of a true definition, we have defined this for our organization. And I can't imagine people getting in trouble for that at that point, right? Now, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but make your own definition in lieu of this, because you probably don't want to lean into this NIST publication at all. And then just go by that if you're ever challenged.
Yeah. I mean, I would have to find it. I believe it was the Rev 3 ODP memo where they have some very open-ended definition. We were talking about this at CS2 on the panel with James from DoD and Matt from the Cyber AB. And they wanted to have a very specific definition of significant, and it got committed into nothing, as these things often do. And so, not having ODPs defined gives you a lot of flexibility to define them however you want to, right? For the most part, CMMC assessments are not audits because there are very few right answers that you need to hit in terms of what's being assessed. They are verification assessments saying, are you doing what you're saying that you're doing? But people really get uncomfortable whenever they aren't given specific guidance. And of course, then what becomes the main complaint? It's too prescriptive, right? Like everybody's like, we want it to be as flexible and open-ended as possible. And then they are like, but tell us exactly what to do.
So crazy.
All right, let's see here. Okay, 48 CFR CMMC, the rule that will finalize the DFARS 252-204-7021 contract clause, that will contain the language that will say you must achieve a given CMMC level 1 through 3 in order to take award of this contract. For about a year now, our prediction for the window for when that rule will be published has been June to October. I am now going to narrow that down to fall of 2025. So sometime between August and October. We're too far along for it to be published in June. Even if it gets sent over to OIRA, on Monday, it's going to be too late for it to be in June. At Seek West yesterday, Stacy Bosch-Janet kind of threw some stuff out there saying she thinks September. But I just posted about this on LinkedIn. Feel free to take the poll, everybody. I'll tell you one thing. I love playing dice in Las Vegas. I won a ton of money playing dice in Las Vegas. And anybody who plays dice knows that the bets in the middle of the table are all for suckers because you're trying to predict the exact number on a single roll of the dice. The only other big sucker bet in the world is trying to predict exactly when rules are going to be published. No one knows exactly what the dice are going to come at, but we only know the range of outcomes for when it's going to happen. Very, very confident that it's going to be August to October. But the next big milestone will be when the rule leaves DoD and goes over to OIRA for regulatory review. If you follow us on LinkedIn, if you follow us on YouTube and all that stuff, you'll hear all about it. We'll update all the timelines, all the visualizations. We'll do podcasts, we'll do videos, we'll do posts, we'll do all that stuff. We'll talk about it on the Q&A. But for right now, we're saying fall of 2025, very end of summer possibly, but probably around fall. So still consistent with what we've been saying. But until we get to the next milestone, it's hard to calibrate what that's going to be. All right.
It's interesting. People try and play the fun crystal ball game, right? It's like, when is this thing actually going to happen?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's totally understandable, right? I mean, you want to know exactly when stuff is going to happen, but the thing about rulemaking is it's hugely impactful and it's impossible to know exactly. You can know generally that it is going to happen, but you can't know specifically when it's going to happen, which is why I lost my hair over the last few years.
Love it.
All righty. Let's get into some of these questions here. What happens if our conditional CMMC status expires during the period of performance of the contract? I believe that the language in the rule says that, well, first of all, a conditional status is when you have open POAM items, right? So you don't have a full CMMC status until you have your POAM closeout assessment. And so if you are given a conditional status and you fail to close out those POAM items within 180 days, your conditional status expires. And I believe the language in the rule is that traditional contract remedies will apply to you and that you will be ineligible for any further awards until that situation is taken care of, which is some very open-ended language in terms of what could possibly happen. And we all know how much people love open-ended language around this, around these parts, but I believe that's what the language of the rule says. I would not let your conditional status expire. 180 days is simultaneously a ton of time for the type of requirements that are allowed to be on a POAM, which is not very many. And it's also not a lot of time. So don't jack around with conditional status.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's, I always jokingly say, like, you can be early, you can be, late, you can't be on time. The same thing kind of applies to here, right? It's like, don't let it lapse, please.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. So there was a question on Reddit. I don't know if I have the screenshot pulled up or not, or if you have any thoughts here specifically, Daniel, but somebody was asking about the NSA Cybersecurity Collaboration Center and the services that they offer. They often frame these against the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 and then sort of say, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, CMMC stuff too. I have my opinions about how they describe their services and how much they facilitate the requirements, but maybe we'll get to your thoughts first so I don't bring down the mood.
Yeah, so it's funny. Somebody brought this up this week because we were talking about artificial intelligence and, what kind of cyber controls would be recommended for it. And NSA has this kind of working group for AI cybersecurity. I think it's NSA, DoD, I want to say, a couple other agencies maybe. CISA, I'm sure, is involved in it as well. But outside of that, I haven't really dug into a lot of the NSA cybersecurity services because I haven't heard anybody really using them, quite honestly. And I think that's probably part of the problem is the adoption of it isn't very strong. We've looked into it. I think our SOC team has looked into some of the threat intelligence feeds and things of that nature. We might even be leveraging them today, but I just don't hear a lot about them, quite honestly, being rolled out into the defense industrial base.
Yeah. So, for those of you who've been around the ecosystem for a while, I've gotten into spats with the NSA CCC leadership on LinkedIn in real life at conferences like Gold Coast, specifically for the same reasons why I have gotten into spats with other MSPs in the ecosystem. Is it's great if you want to offer services, tools, software, whatever you want to do to help the ecosystem. Totally down with it. Not a big deal. As long as you are mapping your services to the verification criteria for the requirements that your solution, service, or whatever helps to satisfy, right? If you only map your solutions or what you do to 800-171 requirements, you are at best, you are leaving out the type of details that people are relying on you to provide to them. And at worst, you are actively misleading people and you are setting them up to fail when it comes to their assessments, which is why we have been telling people for years and years and years, the way that you vet services is against the criteria in 171A. And so I have absolutely zero patience for the government when it's their requirements and their set of verification criteria to not map their own services to their own requirements in the proper way, especially when the people who are offering the services are some of the collaborating authors on the requirements and the verification criteria. I'm not taking crazy pills, right? I know I'm not taking crazy pills, but NSA really doesn't like it whenever I start asking questions about this in conferences. So I'm sure that the services are nice. I'm sure that they're great. I'm sure that they can probably help in some way. But every time in the past that I have pressed them to say, what specifically do you help satisfy? It ends up being a handful of requirements. And even then, it's only a partial amount of the verification criteria. And they tend to describe these things as very large things that aid you with big parts of the requirements. And that's just not true. So do your due diligence, vet government services, just like you would vet services that you pay for, because ultimately you're on the hook for the assessment, regardless of the price that you paid or how free they were or whatever. So same criteria. Just make sure you do your due diligence and don't take the marketing copy at face value from anybody,
Which I don't know if this was an addition after your conversation with them at a conference that I attended with you, but they did add controls down here at the bottom, not assessment objectives, but they at least threw in, it looks like they did. Here we go. The third assessment objective. Yeah. So 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6, they're able to meet here. So again, we appreciate you trying to help. However, to Jacob's point, do due diligence and vet them for the fullness of the controls they're able to meet on your behalf in your CMMC journey. So
yeah, absolutely. And listen, I get it. There are committees that approve this stuff, and it's very hard to get that information out there. But I would not be able to sleep at night if I said, oh, this provider gets a pass, this provider doesn't. Everybody gets vetted the same way. That's the beauty of having standardized requirements and standardized verification criteria. We can all play on the same playing field, which is very, very cool. So check them out, ask them those questions, tell them I sent you, and I'm sure they'll love it.
I'll love it.
Oh man. All righty, let's see here. Will a DIBCAC high assessment result in a CMMC level 2 certification? No, it will not.
Not no more.
Not anymore. Joint surveillance assessments that were done in combination between DIBCAC audit teams and C3PAOs prior to the effective date of the 32 CFR rule in December of 2024 would qualify, if you met the passing score, for conversion to a CMMC level 2 status certification, whatever the verbiage is that they would like to use. But if you get a DIBCAC high assessment pursuant to your other DFARS contract clauses, 7019 and 7020, that is a straight up audit from the DoD, from the Defense Contract Management Agency, that is independent of your CMMC status. So if you didn't get on the boat super early, then you got to deal with that potentially, because it's part of 7019 and 7020. Everybody's using the same scoring, though, which is good to go. Yeah, here's an interesting question, and something that I have been thinking about but have not posted about. Could all these free government services be impacted by cuts to government spending? We had alerts outsourced to X. Yeah, that was really cool. Yeah, they absolutely could. You're dealing with free services, budgets, government shutdowns, things like that. You're hyper dependent on those free services. That's something that you have to consider. Are they going to be around? They seem safe for now, but it all depends. Politics is going to politics, so you never really know. So yeah, it's a good observation there. So, all righty, let's see. Let's get through this backlog, and then we'll take a look at chat in a little bit. Is fundamental research outside of the definition of CUI and therefore compliance requirements? Yes. Fundamental research by definition is not CUI. And therefore, the requirements in 800-171, DFARS 7012 do not apply to you. However, higher education institutions have had an issue where some of the language in the 32 CFR rule and things like that talks about fundamental research that could become CUI, and therefore you get looped in, which to me makes no sense. I know that it makes lawyers' heads explode, where they go, what the heck does that mean? So if you are in the higher education space, if you're in the research space, you have a particular set of fun wordings that you need to deal with that other people do not. It's like in the manufacturing space. It's like, when does G code no longer become CUI? You're in the research space. You're like, when does fundamental research suddenly become CUI? Everybody's got a fun little thing that they got to deal with in their corner of the world.
So to 2 points there, I had two very interesting conversations this week. One with Wendy from Arizona State. So we have a podcast coming out on Tuesday where we actually talk about this exact topic along with export control and how specialized assets were built for manufacturing. However, higher ed's having to sequester them into their own type of technology, right, that they use for research. And but the other one was actually with an R1 research institute doing a lot of regulated research, a lot of healthcare related stuff. And on the call, I thought this was fascinating. On the call, it's a 2-hour demo that I'm doing with them. And at the end of the call, they were like, okay, Daniel, like, listen, none of us can make this executive decision here on the call, but are there universities and regulated research organizations looking to get out of defense grants and contracts because of the burden of CMMC? And I thought that was a fascinating question. I was like, in talking with Wendy, and you'll hear it on the podcast, some organizations are like fundamentals enough for me and I'm not going any further, right? But then you start throwing things like FAR CUI potential. You start throwing in NIH, the National Institute of Healthcare. I can't remember the exact acronym, but other agencies are already throwing 171 at at grants and contracts as a requirement outside of CMMC and DFARS. And so what I told them is like, you can run, but you can't hide. When FAR CUI comes into place, federal aid, student loans, there are certain information that universities collect that 171 is going to be way more far reaching than just regulated research.
Oh yeah.
And anyway, so a couple of really interesting conversations with higher ed this week. And there are challenges there. Like you said, Jacob, right? Fundamental research is to what G code and manufacturing is, right? Where's that delineation of CUI or not? Right. Or where's that delineation of could be, can't be? Who makes that call?
Yeah, Stacy was giving a presentation at Seek West yesterday, and she said something about how the Office of the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, OSD R&E, are going to be changing one of the acronyms to controlled program information or something like that. And we'll have to go back and rewatch what the details are. It'll be on our YouTube channel here pretty shortly. But my immediate thought was I was in a meeting with OSD R&E and all the other undersecretary offices and all the major primes probably 3.5 years ago. It's actually where I met Lauren Ayers, friend of the show, friend of the channel. I was in this meeting and the question came up in this meeting among the primes and the DoD, all the people at the same table. I don't know how I got invited to this meeting, but I was there. And the question came up, when does CUI lose its CUI-ness? At what point does the decomposition, like into G code and things like that, stop being CUI? And the people at R&E who were in charge of this decision just went, we don't know. Nobody knows. And they said, we're working on it and we've never gotten an answer. And so now when I heard that they were going to finagle around with some acronyms, I'm like, could you guys maybe work on that one, since that's like the main question? When does it no longer become CUI? When does fundamental research magically become CUI? These are big policy questions that they've never really answered. So so if you guys have those questions, you should know it's not Stacy Bosjanek, it's not Katie Arrington, it's not James Gillooly, it's OSD R&E. CUI marking issues, not Katie Arrington, not Stacy Bosjanek, it's OSD INS. People who don't go to conferences, they don't go on podcasts, they don't go out in public and talk about it. It's a completely different office. Completely different office. I'm not telling you not to complain about it. We love the complaints. It makes great content. I'm just saying that this is a Wendy's and that they can only help you with CMMC in the CMMC office. All righty. Oh, this was a great question that got in the queue. What types of security technologies are likely also CUI assets because the tool is storing, processing, transmitting CUI? I believe this question last week was from Justin over at Microsoft. So if you're in the chat, Justin, thanks for the question.
Yeah, so we go through this quite a bit, especially when we're telling people to vet MSPs, right? Because a lot of the tools that they're using could process, store, transmit CUI, and you need that defined, right, to understand, because they're going to have to abide by the same cloud requirements, right, being FedRAMP moderate or moderate equivalent. So when we're looking at this, backups, that's a kind of a no-brainer, low-hanging fruit. EDR tools, endpoint detection and response. If they do sandboxing inside of their cloud, got a little bit of a problem, right? Spam filters, another very common one. Your Proofpoint, your Mimecast of the world, right? If it's processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, guess what? We need to be aware of that if it's a cloud service. RMM tools, which is remote monitoring and management. So remote control, file transfer tools, screenshot enablement. These again are things that we have to vet and make sure are meeting the appropriate requirements as part of it. So yeah, there's quite a few of them out there. Just think, okay, in my data flow, because everyone should have their data flow map, put together to understand, to assist in your boundary determination. Which things is this touching? As soon as the minute it touches my environment, let me work that whole process. Let me look at the applications installed, what's supporting these things as security protection assets, what functions are they doing? Are they cloud dependent or not to do their job? Do they do sampling of files? All of that kind of fun stuff. But yeah, there are quite a few out there that when you actually sit down to start making a list, you're like, oh, like there's a lot of tools connected to my system that upload samples or test or are part of the ingestion period to get data into my computer, right? So anyways, that's just a few as examples.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Let's see. One of our favorite people, John, was here. It looks like your question got cut off, John. So if you're still there,
I think he had a second piece of it.
Maybe add the second part. I'll scroll down here. We'll start with this part. If I have, this is exactly what we were talking about. If I have a CUI print and create a drawing of only a portion of the print, just enough to perform that part of an operation, say a bend in the part, is that portion of the drawing CUI? It's not enough to reproduce the entire part. So maybe it actually didn't get cut off because he says it's not enough to reproduce the entire part. So if I crop out just a very specific part of this CUI drawing, is that little portion that I pulled out itself still CUI if I'm just doing like one little operation on it?
Oh boy. Okay, so I wish Ryan Bonner was here. We need to invite him to more of these things. So from my experience in having this conversation with people, I keep going back to this kind of more clarifying point. Is the information that you possess in order to build, assemble, print the part public information, or is it non-public information? Right? So is it specifications that are not mil-spec that the DoD or your prime gave you that are specific tolerances for this particular part that is not public, that is DoD requirements? Then I would say it's probably still going to be CUI. However, if it's proprietary or mil-spec, you could likely fall in the scope of it not being CUI. But I keep going back to the information that you have to possess in order to do this job. Can anybody else find it on Google? Can I buy it off your website with these kind of consumer off the shelf, right? If it's that kind of technology, it's not going to be CUI. But if it's private information between you and the DoD, look up the definition of controlled technical information, and it's likely probably in there because they do like detail manufacturing is like one of the broad topics of CTI, right? So a lot of those are very broad stroke, and they're intended to be to catch a lot of different types of scenarios. So public information, not going to be CUI. Information that's proprietary to you that you didn't develop on behalf of that contract, probably not going to be CUI. Things that the DoD or the prime is dictating to you as a unique non-public information fault tolerance or specific specifications, likely going to be CUI, even if it's just one piece of a 3-piece part.
And the default answer that you'll always get that is technically correct is you got to ask the customer, right? Because it's the customer's data. And unfortunately, that ought to give you a good answer, but it's almost certainly always going to come back as it's always going to be CUI. And unfortunately, as we were talking about earlier, the people who really need to come up with what the policy is for this thing, OSD R&E, have neglected to do that for years and years and years. So we can't tell you specifically. We can give you sort of the framework for how to evaluate that decision. We'll definitely get Ryan Bonner on here again soon. But yeah, I would ask your customer And if you have a good relationship with them, then maybe they can help you out in terms of what's going on. But it gets into an interesting, ship of Theseus philosophical question here, because it's like, okay, if we take the entire part and we crop out all of the individual specifications and then treat them individually, is it still the same ship? Right? How does that work? If I've seen this a lot in certain manufacturing environments where people are like, well, if I crop out the prime's logo and I crop out the distribution statement, then there's nothing that attributes it as defense information, and so therefore it's no longer CUI, which is almost certainly not correct. But it's highly situational, and there probably won't be a clear answer, sadly. So sorry.
Now, there is something called a CDRL, Contract Data Requirements List, that might help indicate if these things are CUI. So one thing you might be able to do, because here's the thing, to Jacob's point, everyone that I've ever met at a prime or at a DoD contracting level has always done CYA with CUI. And that's kind of the default response is, oh, is that CUI? 99% of the time they're going to come back and say, of course it's CUI, with no real justification or grounding on why that's the case. But you can ask for a contract data requirements list, a CDRL, and that might help explain if that particular thing is going to be CUI or not. It's not going to be 100% full answer, but it's going to give you another kind of stepping stone to the determination of if it's going to be CUI or not.
Yeah, now that you say that, it would be interesting, because it's like, okay, if they send you the whole drawing, they're going to say it's CUI, procedural based, whatever. They're going to say the entire drawing is. If you imagine that the customer cropped out that one specific thing that you're talking about and sent it to you, would they still mark it as CUI? I don't know if that's helpful or not. I have a feeling they would mark it as CUI, but it is a very tough, murky, deep rabbit hole to dive into whenever it comes to data identity and making this decision, which is funny because in DFARS 7012, at the very last paragraph for flow down, it says that the contractor is the one that decides whether the data retains its identity. So even in the core regulation itself, they say that it's kind of up to you to make the decision as to whether it makes the identity, which, never mind DOJ in the bushes over there sort of watching your decisions. But yeah, they've even kind of outsourced it to the contractor at that point, which can be great depending on how much risk you want to take.
Right.
But like we talked about earlier, if you ask the government for an answer, they're probably going to give you the government answer and tell you it's all CUI. So, but that's why it pays to work with smart people like Ryan, because he's got a whole system for navigating that process.
Oh yeah, Sandy, we gotta throw Sandy's question up here, because this has been on my mind since the minute that James at CS2 said these words. So, if encrypted CUI data is still CUI, does that mean that every router on the internet which can receive and transmit that encrypted data is handling CUI and must be certified? I believe the origination of this, James Galuli, there's the word, said from CS2 a couple weeks ago that there's a paper coming out, or there's some stronger definition of what the requirements will be for things that are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI that is encrypted to FIPS 140-2. Basically bringing in more assets along that data flow into scope that historically, due to export control ITAR carve-outs, we've considered out-of-scope assets, or at best CRMAs for the most part. So what's really concerning about this is when you start pulling this thread, alternate work sites, right? Okay, well, my home office, do I need a full-blown firewall and separate network now? Right? Because the VPN traffic that's encrypted is not enough, or the TLS 1.2 traffic, Sandy, to your point, transversing the World Wide Web is encrypted to that FIPS standard in transit. Are those things in scope? The things that I can't control outside of my boundary? That gets a little bit hard for certification, obviously, for independent organizations. But back to your point, Sandy, I have to wait for the definition before I make too many assumptions, because the logic used, which I can't necessarily refute the logic initially, is you have a bank vault inside of a bank, right? Special locks and numpads and timers and all that stuff. Consider that your FIPS validated cryptography, right? That is your FIPS module, and the cache inside is your CUI. The logic that was, as we were talking, is, well, the bank still has a lock on the front door, right? The bank itself still wants a level of protection. And so throughout the dialogue that we were having, basically he's saying the systems in the path of that CUI, being the vault itself, should also be protected. You should also have a lock on that door, right? Question is, how big of a lock? Is it going to have to follow all the CUI asset requirements? Is it just going to do relevant controls? What does that look like? Jacob, help me out here. Oh, no.
It was right when I had to sneeze.
Oh, man. Okay. I was like, man, just drop the mic here a little bit.
I believe producer Dustin will have to let us know. I believe that's the first sneeze live on this stream. So sorry. Oh. Right when you asked me what my thoughts were was when I was trying to hold back a sneeze. So you're going to have to get me caught back up on the question. What was your question again? Sorry.
All right. So we were talking about the potential, new publication from the DoD saying that yes, CUI that is encrypted, the things in as part of that data flow would also be in scope. That the out of scope and the carve out that we've, long-standingly used would not be applicable moving forward once this publication is released. So my question to you is, what do you think those requirements are going to be? Do you think that the logic makes sense that these things should be in scope? Help me out here just a little bit.
Well, have you ever watched a friend make decisions that aren't going to turn out well, and you just love them to death, but you're just like, you really are setting yourself up for a bad time here? I don't know what the heck the DoD is talking about, because as Sandy has pointed out, as literally everyone in the audience pointed out in real time at CS2 as James was talking, unless there is some sort of magical thing in this paper that no one in the hive mind of the ecosystem has thought up yet, which I highly, highly doubt, they are going to put out a incredibly inconsistent position about what's going on with encrypted CUI still being CUI. Because basically, from what I can remember, and hopefully we'll get the videos up on YouTube here soon, from what I can remember, James basically said, yeah, we care about encrypted CUI being CUI in cloud environments, and we just don't really care about it whenever it's in every other scenario in which it would be considered in scope. And so we can just hold this cognitive dissonance in our mind and then be irrational about it. And that's the policy. To me, that makes it seem like the lawyers are going to be doing backflips, because that's not a regulation. It's a very inconsistent interpretation. It's just written in some white paper somewhere that is alleged to exist, and it doesn't make any damn sense. It makes no sense at all. So I don't know what the requirements are going to be. I don't know how they got themselves into that logical position, but maybe there's something crazy in this white paper. What was the warp drive technology in Star Trek that allowed humanity to explore the stars? Maybe they got somebody in there that has encrypted CUI as CUI warp drive formula that they cracked on the back of a napkin, and it's all going to blow our minds. I have a feeling that it was a very insular white paper shopped around inside of the Pentagon, and it didn't see the light of day, and it's going to come out and people are going to absolutely smash it to pieces. And we're all going to laugh about it and make content about it for several months until they walk it back, and then we start all over again. So I don't know. I have no idea. It makes no sense to me.
And that, to your point, Will, following that analogy that the DoD gave, but the bank controls the security, controls the facility. The DIB contractor does not control the internet. Absolutely, right? That's can in no world be part of their boundary. Maybe a better analogy would be sending CUI printed material via FedEx. That would be a good example. Also, home routers. Right? Your work from home policy, if my encrypted connections from here to the Microsoft Gov Cloud over TLS, and that's FIPS encrypted, right? Validated modules for the encryption, then guess what? That would bring my home network in scope now, which it didn't used to, right? So there's a lot of things when you start kind of pushing down the dominoes, things start collapsing here pretty fast.
I think it's going to, oh yeah, sorry.
Only a serenity prayer approach to the internet is viable at that point. So yes, I agree with that.
I think it's the same thing, right? Probably the number one category of questions that we get on the Q&A is scoping style questions. And so when they are messing around with interpretations of encryption that will dramatically expand scope, you're going to have riots, right? Like you're going to have people with pitchforks and torches because everyone is trying to narrow scope as much as possible because it keeps things simpler. It keeps costs down. It makes it less complex. It makes the assessments faster. And now they're out here being like, hey, we have a secret that we can't tell you yet that's going to absolutely explode scope everywhere. And so people are already just like pulling the slingshot all the way back, waiting to shoot this thing down. So I have no idea. This is why I was saying the metaphor. If you've ever watched a friend set themselves up for a bad situation, I'm like, please don't do that. Like, you really should not do that. That's not a good idea.
Well, the problem is if that information is taken by the cyber AB and what I would call weaponized in assessments as the new standard, you're going to, okay. I brought this up to the university I was talking to this week because they were using a physical firewall with logical separations, or they were wanting to do that, right? And then the work from home policy came up and things like that, alternate work sites. And I was like, yeah, like if this happens, then the data, even though encrypted, would bring every hop along the way into scope. Like there's just no other way around it, right? And so there is no real carve out concept anymore if this happens, which brings larger enterprises into scope when you're looking at enclaves, right? I mean, it is just so, yeah, it's a lot to say the least. We'll see though.
Yeah, so people are saying that, maybe the line is what, it's what you control, right? But that isn't the fundamental policy contradiction, right? Because they're not saying that things that you control are part of your scope. What they're saying is that encrypted data is no longer considered just encrypted data, right? And that somehow there are two states of encrypted data. There's encrypted CUI in an environment you control, and there's encrypted data in an environment you don't control. And in an environment you don't control, we don't care. And in an environment that you do control, we do care. So then all that does is incentivize you to put the data that would otherwise be something that they care about in environments that you don't control, which is the exact opposite of what they would like people to do with data that they care about. So, scoping things based off of control is 100% correct. That's how scoping has always worked in terms of authorization boundaries, assessment boundaries, is what you control and what you don't. But as soon as we say, well, inside of your authorization boundary, encrypted data matters, and outside encrypted data doesn't matter because encryption, then we're talking about encryption or not authorization boundaries. So I don't know how they got themselves into the situation. We got to see the paper in order to see what's going on. But it's a huge can of worms, and people are on edge about it.
So for those that don't know, kind of the premise of where this comes from is ITAR. If you have the data encrypted, the FIPS module, if you look at the actual NIST CMVP or CVMP website, I can't remember the acronym there, it actually says it's not considered plain text if it's encrypted to this state with FIPS 140-2, or now we're evolving to -3. So meaning I could take that ITAR data and stick it in the UK, okay, right? They're a friendly country. We can't stick the data in China or Russia, but let's say we stick it in the UK and it's still ITAR data, meaning it has certain requirements around US persons and US access unless you have export control licenses. I can do that as long as I, a US person, am holding the decryption key, right? That means I'm the only one that can unlock that because it's not really considered ITAR unless you can open it up and see the data, right? And that's where that encryption key piece would come into play. And so everyone's been taking that same stance with CUI, and this basically throws that out the window. Now, we haven't read the paper. We haven't seen the paper. Throws that out the window, which brings a lot more assets in scope than what would traditional, historical beliefs would have. So
I just remembered this as you were talking. We've been dwelling on this one for a minute, so we can move on in a second. But I remember hearing about this at CS2, which I promise we will get the videos up soon. But there's now this idea, it's probably in that paper from the DoD, that there is a third state of encryption where you've got unencrypted data, you've got encrypted data, but if the key exists for the encrypted data, then it's a caveat, and then they care about it, and you're like, I don't know. So apparently the paper is like 35 pages long. So I'm sure it's a barrel of laughs We'll all have to look at it whenever it comes out. Scott asked, is the concern around quantum? I don't know. I mean, that would seem like they're really jumping the shark. And if you are concerned about quantum, then, the point earlier about the internet being broken is just as valid, because China has been demonstrating that they can hack BGP, pipes in the internet at will, essentially. And so I don't know. I don't know what their logic is.
If this third state is no encryption key, that's not going to stop quantum. They're going to break the encryption. So it's like, we'll see. We'll see on that. So
it'll be. I'm sure that's going to come out on a Friday before.
I cannot wait to. Hey, Memorial Day is Monday, so I mean, maybe it'll come out today.
Maybe right when the stream ends. All righty, let's see here.
Can I go back to John real quick and finish out his
sure
his thing? So John had the manufacturing question from earlier. Yes. So CUI can be person, places, things, people, technology, the whole shebang, right? So physical things can be controlled unclassified information, right? Just the design elements of it solely don't constitute being CUI. The actual part could also be CUI as part of that. Jacob, just because when you're looking at authorization, you need to make sure that the people building the part, or you're securely transporting the part, that you're following kind of that chain all the way through.
Yeah, absolutely.
But things are CUI too. So
let's see here. Any idea? I don't know if we have a slide on this. Any idea on joint ventures and CMMC and the what that entails?
So I don't have a slide on it, but it's a very common conversation. And there was another question asked earlier about, can you add a cage code after your certification's been done, right? So the certification is made up of kind of two major components: your DoD UID, which is your assessment boundary or scope, and the cage codes leveraging that DoD UID, right? That assessment boundary, which can be multiple. And so what a lot of people have been doing for enclaves is adding in multiple cage codes. So for the sake of a joint venture, what we've seen people doing is contracting the same C3PAO, and that joint venture might be using the exact same enclave as the standalone enterprise, right, outside of the joint venture. And so basically going through multiple assessments with the same DoD UID, but legally registering two different certifications, one for the joint venture and then one for the parent, right, that's leveraging the enclave solely. So I haven't actually seen this play out. That's just what I've heard. So if there's any assessors in the chat that have any other clarifying points, feel free to drop them in there. But that's been my understanding thus far when it comes to joint ventures.
Gotcha. All righty. Let's see. Somebody said phased 1 of the rollout means all solicitations. This was news to them. Yes, that is what that means. When the phased rollout begins, all solicitations from that point will have some form of CMMC requirement in those solicitations as a condition of contract award. Now, the big question is, what status level will you need to achieve in those various phases of the phased rollout? A lot of people believe that first year of the phased rollout will only be self-assessment. But just to clarify, there will be a CMMC status requirement in all new solicitations of some form once that phased rollout begins. Now, this was probably the most common question that I heard being asked of DoD this week at Seek West in Las Vegas was, can I self-assess during phase 1? Will there only be self-assessments in phase 1? Phase 1 will only be self-assessments, right? I mean, it was question after question after question, self-assessment. So what Stacy said is not consistent with what the policy says. This is not the first time that's happened. That's why we love tuning in to all the fun things that DoD says at various conferences and webinars and interviews and things like that. So what the policy says is that the DoD is going to have this phased rollout and that all new solicitations will have a CMMC status level. Now, not part of the policy is the clarifying part of the rule where DoD says we expect that the majority of these solicitation requirements will be self-assessment requirements, in that first phase. And then later on in the rule, they say this will be subject to the policy in 32 CFR 170, the CMMC program. And when you go read that policy, it says that it's up to DoD's discretion as to whether or not it will be a C3PAO assessment or a self-assessment, and that the DoD expects that very few will be self-assessments. And then you go on to read other clarifying policies, specifically the memo that was given to the acquisition workforce and the program managers. And it says nothing about the fact that there's a moratorium on level 2 external assessments. There's no ban on level 2 C3PAO assessments in phase 1. What that memo says is that data within the defense index grouping of the NARA CUI registry, controlled technical information, naval nuclear propulsion information, critical safety information, and one or two others, that data, if it's involved in the contract, requires level 2 C3PAO assessment. All other categories of CUI, which for the majority of the DIB you never deal with, are eligible for self-assessment, right? So that means that there is a ton of data that could have a self-assessment, and that a ton of the contractors in the DIB will never see that data, which means you're getting a level 2 C3PAO assessment. There is no policy that has been issued by the DoD that says that level 2 assessments must be or will be self-assessment. There is no policy out there that says that they cannot be level 2 C3PAO assessments. So if we get away from what DoD is saying, right, and what the policy says, and just put on our caps about how the contract workforce operates, they are being told this data, this requirement, end of story, right? Which means, what are they going to do? Are they going to suddenly reverse decades of their behavioral patterns and say, let me stop and think about how I could creatively interpret what they meant to say or what they ought to have said in order to alleviate a burden on the DIB for some existing requirement? That will not happen. That will not happen. Do not hope for a level 2 self-assessment in this first phase of the phased rollout, because if you are wrong and you have not been preparing, you are going to be in a world of hurt and you won't be able to take award of the contract. Now, Stacy might disagree, right? I disagree with what she said at Seek West, so take it with a grain of salt. But based on my experience of reading the policy and how DoD can sometimes say things that are different and how the contract workforce is operated, I am very, very confident. I'm calling it now. Level 2 self-assessments will be extremely rare, and there will be level 2 certification assessments in phase 1 everywhere.
It's CYA. It's just human behavior. And listen, I know there's policies, and this was the memo circulated back in January, I think, right, to the contracting officers. Yep. They're going to see this, and they're going to say, yeah, I'm not going to get caught with my pants down if this should have been a certified, contract or a self-attest contract. Like, I'm going to try and put the highest watermark possible so I am CYAing myself as a contracting officer. And hey, if one person, I forget who on the podcast with you and Jason said this, but like, I'm okay with only 3 submissions for a contract. It's less paperwork I have to go through.
The contract officers say that all the time.
Right. They're like, I actually would welcome fewer submissions when it came to this. And so they could almost have their cake and eat it too, where they're self-insulating to make sure that, hey, I'm going to put the highest watermark possible on this contract requirement, and I get to do less paperwork because there's only going to be 2 or 3 people that submit for this, right? So, when you look at human behavior, when you look at the past for the overmarking, the everything CUI, the fill in the blank that we all love and hate, then we're going to see some of that same behavior. There's just no way the DoD can control that many contracting officers. And they've already released the memo that was given to all of them, right? So this is kind of the governing filter that they're going to use moving forward. They might not have even seen the memo that include the phased rollout, right? And the more harsh language about just solicit, self-attestation, and that's the intent of it. They're going to see, oh, that might have been the intent, but it also says at my discretion, I get to pick what goes on it. So at my discretion, you're going to get certified. I
Yeah, that
just
was
know it's going to
yep.
happen. I know it's going to happen.
Yep, that was the main thrust of the webinar that we did after the proposed rule and after the final rule. I mean, it was the thing out of all the stuff in the rule, hundreds and hundreds of pages. It was the thing that I keyed in on the most. Was as soon as it says discretion, you don't know and you cannot predict what's going to happen, and you have to err on the side of caution. So,
and that's what it says. Discretion.
Yep. Okay. We are opting to move to company issued managed mobile phones, no Bluetooth. Are there other settings or features that we should address?
Really, really big one is, at least with like iOS devices, even Android devices, backing up of the data, right? So be very careful that you're either not permitting it, that they're doing it with an email address approved for iCloud for that managed device, things like that. Because even though you're going to have CUI, ideally through mobile application management, controlled in a select few applications, there could still be CUI existing outside of that, right? And if iCloud is backing up that data, then you've got a little bit of a problem there, right? So one of the major things, you're going to do the classics. You're going to enforce a PIN code. You're going to enforce, iOS is encrypted out of the box. I think Android Knox is as well now at this point. But you're going to have several things you're going to want to turn on. But the biggest one that we see people get dinged on all the time is controlling the backup and making sure that no CUI data is getting backed up to a non-compliant, non-FedRAMP cloud, specifically with an account that you don't control. That's their personal account. We just partnered with a company called Hypori, Hypori, that does VDI streaming of an Android instance off a mobile phone. So it's like you hit a button and it launches a VDI Android interface with all your managed apps in there. That way there's complete separation from your physical device altogether, right? It's the same concept of an out of scope asset for a Windows VDI, right? So that's pretty cool. That's a really cool technology. If you're more interested in it, feel free to reach out to me and I can send you some content on it. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll be on stage with the Hypori guys at National Cyber Summit after the summer.
Nice.
So if you guys are going to be in Huntsville, then you can stop by and check them out. We were in Reston with them in February. So yeah, love the Hypori team. They're pretty great. Let's see here. Michael had a question. A bit of housekeeping. Yeah, Michael said, love hearing the answers to the questions. Have you thought about summarizing them in text-based format? Yes, that is a project that we are actively working on. Once you reached a critical mass of questions, you can kind of get a distribution of what the most common questions or common themes of questions are. So yeah, the team behind the scenes is actively working on getting that stuff posted up there. We're coming up on 40-ish sessions.
With as much content as we have, we should build like a CUI hotline LLM or something like that.
We
need to Jacobify ChatGPT a little bit.
That's right. That's all anybody really wants is just multiple bots of me harassing them online. But yeah, that is in the works, Michael, but it's a great question. So thanks for that. Okay, there was a question in here. I didn't see who the user was, but it was also a question on Reddit last week. If COTS is supposedly not subject to CMMC, not supposedly, it's not. What security protection asset isn't COTS? Conversely, on MSP, MSSPs, their tools can pull characters from Teams, other chat tech. So essentially, this question was similar to the one on Reddit. If COTS is exempt from CMMC, why are security protection assets held to the requirements? We are misunderstanding the COTS exemption. So the COTS exemption applies to acquisitions for COTS products, not your use of COTS products in your environment, right? So if the government is buying something that is a commercial off-the-shelf product, then certain requirements don't apply to it. There is an exemption for the purchase of COTS products by the government. If you, the contractor, are buying networking equipment and computers and phones and desks and printers,
clouds,
those are COTS products, but you're not the government buying them. That's just you buying them. So COTS is an exemption for a government acquisition, not an exemption for the things that you buy yourself to use in your business environment. So yeah, it's I think the question was like, if it's supposedly exempt, it is exempt, but it's from the perspective of the government when they're buying things, not from your perspective as the contractor. All righty, let's see here.
Do you want to do one more and wrap up, Jacob?
Yeah, I think we're getting there. Let's see. This was an interesting question that came through. Is it okay to hold CUI conversations on a personal device while using Teams via Microsoft Horizon?
Well, that's a lot of layers to that one.
That
So
is.
anything that process, stores, and transmits CUI is going to be in scope of a CUI asset, unless your mouse, keyboard, or in this case, monitor, right? If a VDI setup is in place, which Horizon does do a VDI session, then that physical device is out of scope. However, that does not curtail your need or acceptable use policy to just blast that audio wide open for unauthorized users, right? So even though the technology, if you're using a VDI session, is out of scope technically, the room that you're in listening to that conversation is not out of scope. The people that you're listening to or that are overlooking your shoulder that are non-authorized users. So there can be a place where the technology itself is out of scope, but the place that you're sitting with the technology is still in scope. And at that point, you need to make sure that you have authorization for those users and, potentially parts of the facility. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do one more quick one here. They've had this in the queue for a while, and I was late today because of technical issues. Are you aware of CMMC standards applying to federal agencies outside of DoD, such as the State Department? Yes.
Yeah.
Very, very strong chance from what we've heard, very confident that it would at least be NASA and GSA in addition to the DoD. I've also heard people talk about it at State Department as well as the National Nuclear Security Administration for some of their well-documented supply chain oversight issues. Katie Arrington gave an interview a month or two ago where she was talking about how all of the federal CIOs are pursuing an initiative to federalize CMMC. So lots of smoke, lots of rumors, lots of indications that, yes, it will expand beyond DoD. But that probably wouldn't happen until the contract clause is finalized and it's up and running. But I would not be surprised to see that happen over time.
So I've already heard of it happening with Department of Transportation. We have a construction company we work with that's like, yeah, they threw in 171 requirements on this data. I forgot it was SSI data, I think is what it was called. I can't remember the exact type of CUI they had. But yeah, I've already seen that. And then National Institute of Health. We were seeing that requirement now getting levied in the higher ed that I was talking to this week. So it is popping up in lieu of FAR CUI happening. It is just really starting to pick up some steam because honestly, they're just kind of riding the coattails of DoD. They're going to have the largest of all supply chains. And if DoD is going to go ahead and require this, other agencies are like, it's no problem for us to throw it on. That seems to be the attitude right now.
Yeah.
So.
What are they going to do? Come up with their own program and their own AB and their own this and their own standard and their own that? Or are they just going to wait for it to all be done and then just say, go do that? Especially since the standard is the same for everybody, right? All righty, everybody. It is the end of the stream. We've been here for an hour. We do this every Friday. If we didn't get to your question, we'll add it to the queue. You can always go on CUIHotline.org and fill out the form. There's a bunch of awesome questions in there that we're going to add to the queue for next week. You can call the number and leave your message on there. Our DMs are open on LinkedIn. Follow us on YouTube. Follow us on LinkedIn. If you find this stream afterwards, you can throw it in chat down there as a comment. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys. See you.